This episode is brought to you by Homes for Our Troops, a nonprofit helping build and donate homes to injured post 9/11 veterans. Visit hfotusa.org for more information. I'm Rod Rodriguez.
I'm Jack Murphy.
This is Military Matters. There are currently more than 2.5 million post 9/11 veterans. Still a small segment of the country, but consider for a moment that there are approximately 1.4 million active military personnel serving right now. This is an important figure to consider when we're discussing the transition process for today's veterans. But today's guest is also considering how they feel about the wars they've been part of and how they're coming to terms with war that never really ended. Jack Murphy talks with Navy veteran Dr. Daniel Green about his book Front Toward Enemy: War, Veterans, and the Homefront. They discuss the chasm that exists between GWOT veterans and the society around them, dealing with wars that have ended but not the way they wanted them to, and how they're expressing those frustrations through literature, film, and the stage. Transition is more than finding a new job. Sometimes it's about finding yourself. Jack Murphy talks with Dr. Daniel Green.
All right, so I'm here today with Dan Green. He's the author of Front Toward Enemy: War, Veterans, and the Homefront. And Dan, could you just start off a little bit telling us a little bit about, your military and then civilian background and sort of how that led you into writing this book?
Sure. I was working at the Pentagon in 2001 as a civilian, and I was there on 9/11 when the plane hit, and I knew some folks who'd been killed. And I'd already started looking at joining the military before that, but that just was, all the more reason to join. And so I joined the Navy Reserves in June of 2003. Took a while to get into the program. And then in the military, I've been in for 20 years. This June, I've done 4 mobilizations from the reserves, 2 to Iraq, 2 to Afghanistan, 2 where I was attached to SEAL teams as an intelligence officer when I flew to Iraq in 2007, Afghanistan in 2012, and then a couple individual augmentations. And then I did a year with the State Department in 2005-06 with in Afghanistan. Worked at a provincial reconstruction team as a political officer, political advisor there. And that, I think coming back repeatedly, at least 5 different times, definitely started me to sort of see the patterns of how I would come back from deployments. And I found a lot of the books written by psychologists, however helpful in many ways, didn't address the great bulk of certainly the experiences I had had. And, I'm like you, I'm kind of a student of history. I've read deeply of World War II and the Civil War and Vietnam. And I just felt like a lot of the books focused mostly on your experience with violence, committing violence or experiencing violence, and themes that kind of flow from that. And I just felt like there was so much more to this experience that wasn't being talked about. And the vast majority of books were written by people who had never been in the military or had been to Iraq and Afghanistan. So I thought, I don't have a psychology degree, but maybe I have a perspective that's helpful.
Well, yeah, to use that as kind of a start point, one of the things I'd be interested to ask you, based on your research, is what do you think differs from war on terror veterans to veterans of our past conflicts? You spend a bit of time in your book talking about Vietnam vets, World War II vets, and then, of course, our generation. I was just wondering what your findings were, coming out of that.
Yeah, if you think about what describes this generation, it's a generation that grew up after Vietnam and the consequences of that sort of struggle's termination. It grew up in an America that had embraced gender equality, always working on it, but legally it was no longer allowed to discriminate. It was an economy that was also shifting from industrial to post-industrial, more about brain than brawn. Huge shifts in demographics to the South and the West, from the Midwest and the North. And then you have a generation that has done, our country was attacked. So it's like, no kidding, we're fighting to respond to that, but it's not a nation state. So that's kind of a unique situation. And then we have possibly the experience of going to 2 different conflicts and then have a repeated tour. So it's not just, we did our one tour, maybe like 2 years in World War II when we come back, but gosh, we've done repeatedly these tours and we change, the wars change, and our perspectives change. And then the types of these conflicts, yes, there's combat, but there's counterinsurgency, there's adapting to the military, there's living in a developing country and working to develop their governing institutions, their schools, their wells, all these kinds of other tasks. And then they're in predominantly Muslim countries, of great difference in many ways, but some commonalities. So I think you just have an interesting generation of people who just, parts of them have only known this conflict for 20 years. That's all they've really ever done. If they weren't over there, they were coming back, getting ready to go again, writing about it, podcasting about it, and it was never, and it never ended. There was no victory parade as well. So we have all the instincts of our countries has been attacked because of 9/11. So we feel that acutely, but we'll never have full closure because there's never going to be a peace, signing ceremony about it, from the enemy. It's going to be weird. We're in this weird nether region of, perpetual war but no perpetual peace,
And still trying to figure it out, probably. I mean, I talked to guys who are like 75-year-old Vietnam veterans, and they're still talking about the war because they're still trying to understand it, And so tell me a little bit more about your book, about Front Toward Enemy, and some of the like deep dives that you get into, like very specific GWAT veteran culture.
Yeah, sure. I think like a lot of vets who served in these wars, you come back home to civilian culture, and the way your war is discussed, the veterans of these conflicts are usually seen, as I see it, as either heroes, victims, or psychopaths.
Right.
And we're usually one or all three of those categories at some points in our lives, it feels like. And I feel like it caused me to wonder, like, why isn't the war, as I experienced it, being understood on the home front? And we all know, unless you directly experience it, you have to go through these mediating layers of either books, TV shows, movies, local news programs, and all these kind of things. And then it prompted me to think sort of what are the kinds of things that are being talked about? How are they being mediated? How are they being presented? So, like, for example, with war memoirs, there's been so many. I'm still gathering data, but like when I published the book, I'd found about 168 Iraq-Afghan war memoirs that come out since 9/11. And what's so fascinating about them is, kind of unsurprisingly, a large bulk of them are written by SEALs, Green Berets, infantry, and kind of combat arms, which is great. That they're mostly involved in combat. They're mostly involved in shaping and clearing operations, and that sells. But the hold, build, transition stuff isn't very sexy, but it's also important, very important, in fact. And what that does, I think, is it causes Americans on the home front to think, well, gosh, it's all about just combat over there. These are the only books I'm seeing. And
right.
On top of that, you have the genre of the memoir has also changed. You have, instead of you did your tour, you come back, the war you won, or you're never going back, you write your one memoir. You can have multiple memoirs now. Few vets have written, a number of them have written 2 or 3 war memoirs now, or if they've written one, it sometimes has multiple tours. And so the memoir itself has changed as a genre from the past. I mean, when you write the first memoir, your first time in combat, you've come home, the themes are familiar to all of us, right? It's that first trip overseas, maybe touch of camaraderie, loss of innocence, your friend gets killed or injured, you see a local national who gets killed, it tugs at your heartstrings. You start to shake your fist at the generals because the strategy's not right. These are all very familiar. Right. Like every memoir is like this by and large. But imagine you're your 4th tour. You're well past that in your mind. You're like, your hair's gray now. You're grizzled. And you have a deeper understanding, maybe wisdom and perspective. And so that memoir is a little different, And that's just like one small example. But we've got female veterans who've written memoirs. There's one memoir, the title escapes me, but it's written by an enlisted Marine, and she was in a mortuary affairs unit her whole tour. Her whole book is just simply processing the dead bodies of Marines to send them home. That's nuts. That's crazy. And they give you a form to fill out, and you have to shade in the parts of the body that are missing. And that's her whole memoir. And there's no memoir like it so far that I've found in this generation. But that's a very powerful, memoir.
Well, to just add a little levity to that pretty dark story, I found a Desert Storm memoir about an officer who had served as a gynecologist in Desert Storm.
That's great.
and I asked my employers, not Stars and Stripes, my other employers, if I could write a review of this memoir, and they were like, "No, you can't, Jack."
They can't handle the truth. They can't handle the truth. That's great. I tell you, the niche ones are fascinating. I think because we've had so many female veterans publish, and the female vets, as you know, were using combat arms. Their memoirs are getting published in part because they're female veterans, but because they serve in these unusual, often support positions, you actually get an interesting perspective you normally wouldn't get.
Right.
Which I think is fascinating. Then you have general officer memoirs. You have wounded vets coming back and or kind of coming back to duty memoirs. You have what other ones you have? You have Valorious Decoration recipients, Medal of Honor, Navy Cross. So there's very distinct categories, but the memoir itself has changed in a lot of ways. And I think the memoirs themselves, depending on when you were there, the invasion Iraq memoir is very different from the surge Iraq memoir.
Yeah.
And so the security conditions change, violence goes from direct to more indirect. All the garrison mentality breaks out over time, so it's more, later books, you see more reflective belts being mentioned than in the beginning,
I'm afraid I'm guilty of producing one of those Ranger Green Beret memoirs, and the cover of it, there's like this smoke added, this fog that's coming over me. So I'm fully aware that it is a genre of book.
No, it's good. And like later novels in the war, later memoirs in the war, the local nationals now have names. They have maybe background stories. There's the writer is more familiar with counterinsurgency doctrine. He or she is savvier on how to work with local populations, and there's more discussing reconstruction and development stuff, not just combat. So it's all these things. I've probably added maybe 30 or 40 more memoirs to my tracker since this book came out. So it's a constantly evolving thing.
What do you think that, when you kind of zoom out and take a broader look at this genre of war memoirs to come out of the GWAT? I mean, are there any sort of large scale conclusions that you come to?
Yeah, because we don't have a draft, when you had a draft, you would bring people in who never thought they'd ever serve in the military. So you get the random poet from Tennessee all of a sudden, right? You get the Kurt Vonnegut who never would have probably joined normally, and that changes how novels as well as memoirs are written and who writes them. And I haven't done a deep dive. I've been collecting novels from our generation, and there aren't that many, and it's kind of hard for them to resonate with a civilian population. Like a lot of the novels that have done well seemingly have come from people who've gotten a master's in literature after they came back. And that's been kind of the kissing the ring that they're now acceptable to have written a novel for the civilian population.
Well, I'm sorry to object to a certain genre of war memoir, but you put the number of people you killed on the cover of the book.
Yes. And that's kind of been sort of, there's that book Carnivore, which is very, the initial title when it came out was the memoir, the deadliest American in Iraq, but then it sort of got revised after people pushed back. I actually looked at titles of all of our memoirs, what words show up the most. A lot of it's American, just American soldier, General Franks' memoir, all these kind of American Spartan, Jim Gant, death, kill. It's a lot of that, shaping, clearing operations, and there is a genre of hope, hold, build, transition memoirs, but they're more niche. They're not well known, and there'll never be a movie written about them or made about them. Excuse me. But another thing I talk about in the book is the collecting of military items. I call it militaria.
The memorabilia. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, for me growing up, and my grandfather had served in World War II, so we had an ammo can in the house. We had stories of a Luger that had been acquired and then lost. We had his uniform with the ruptured duck symbol on it that he'd been honorably discharged. And these were, as a child, pre-internet, these were huge items in my mind and my imagination. So you go to Iraq and Afghanistan, as you know, Afghanistan's littered with all the detritus of past wars. You can gather so much. And then Iraq, typically it'd be samples from the sovereignty of the Iraqi state. So Iraqi Republican Guard stuff.
And dinars.
Yeah, exactly. What would you collect from an insurgency in Afghanistan? It'd be a pocket letter, might be a night letter, might be an item that's to be insurgent, but doesn't have any outward appearance of being, an enemy garb or anything. So I think all these things, and so but the militaria items though become these sort of I call them talismans of testosterone. It's it's like this example that, hey, I took this from the enemy, I've imposed my will on him, And oh, by the way, you other guys who haven't done it yet, check me out. I have passed the supreme test. You've not yet passed it yet. But then on the home front, certain items are very highly valued, more out of proportion than maybe veterans would value them sometimes. And I think when veterans come home and they finally really get out of the military, these items, yeah, they're in a Foot Locker for a while, but then after a while, they sort of, you miss the culture. Yeah, you miss the culture. But by what's collected, though, that also shapes our collective memory down the road.
Right.
So you go, like I talked about this show called The Show of Shows. It's got 2,000 tables of militaria in Louisville, Kentucky. It's an amazing place. The vast majority of the tables, apparently the German Wehrmacht won World War II. I mean, it's based on, I mean, it's everywhere. It's everywhere. And there's like a couple tables of Japanese items. And then I always have an eye out for Iraq, Afghanistan. I literally will see 2, maybe 3 items amongst 2,000 tables.
You know, here, okay, so on that note, here's a little observation I would interject. Because I'm like an uber nerd, I once in a while go to these like modeling conventions, and not like Victoria's Secret runway modeling.
I know that's in your past now. Yeah.
I mean like militaria, diorama. People make those like World War II dioramas and stuff. I'm like, that's super cool. Right. I went to one of these things and I saw one, and it was a like a striker stuck in the mud in Iraq, like circa 2005. This guy had like beautifully detailed this diorama, but I'm looking at it, I'm like, oh my God, that's me. Am I this old? What?
Yeah, exactly right. You've gotten to that point now. Yeah, it's an interesting. I mean, it's interesting to see how your experience is chronicled, and then what do they collect?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and then I have a section like there's beside the show of show, there's all these little local shows, and I think for a lot of vets, it's just a way of like continuing the experience and commemorating it. But there's another chapter you might find interesting. I think it's called Stolen Valor and Fake Veterans. And, you know, we all have anecdotes of running into people like this, even if it's in the military, but there hasn't been as much of a systematic look at it. So I went through 200 stolen valor examples from 2018. There's a website called This Ain't Hell, which actually FOIAs their records, so you kind of know what the person did or what they claim to do. Or I went through 100. No, I went through 100 of them, excuse me, not 200. And I just took the first 100, whatever they were, randomly. And of the 100, 3 were women, so 97 were men. Of the 100, 79 had prior military service. And of the 79, 76 were prior enlisted service. So only 3 officers, the highest ranking of which was an O3. And amongst the enlisted, the highest ranking I could find was an E6. So in that first 100, it's overwhelmingly a prior enlisted male sort of thing. And then when you look at what they say of the top 6 most frequently asserted things, number one, of the 5 of the top 6 were special operations related in some way. So even like Marine, which would be totally legit to say Marine infantry, right, you're fake, but that's legit. That's got respect. They don't say that. They'll say MARSOC, Marine Raider. It has to have a little bit of a sexiness to it.
Did you have any finding about how many of them do it for monetary gain versus how many are like in it for the glory?
Yeah, you know, the data wasn't always that systematic, but it was like 5 or 6 common reasons. Yeah, I mean, a lot of it's just for making money. Well, a lot of it, frankly, is a sense of belonging, to be part of something, to feel special, even if it's in your local community. And that's it. You may not even make any money, but you're going to be the guest of honor in the local 4th of July parade,
right? Right.
Which is totally, you know, I understand that instinct. Yeah, there's money, there's romance, there's this, you know, criminality. The usual factors, but the number one most frequently asserted thing was SEALs was number one. It was like 34 of the 100 said they were SEALs. Then I think it was Green Berets / Rangers. Third was like MARSOC type, you know, and then it goes down from there. And then in terms of medals, no one really said Medal of Honor or Distinguished Service Cross, like 1 or 2. They all go for Silver Star, Bronze Star, V, Purple Heart. So they go just below where it'd be very easy to prove it to where it's harder to prove it.
Right.
You know, so it's like a perfect like sweet spot. And they don't say things like fighter pilot, because that's usually college educated and the technical knowledge will trip them up. They don't say indirect violence. They're never a proud artillery person. You know, I mean, if they just did that, no one would really question it. And they never really say straight legged as infantry, just basic infantry. They've got to have that special operations because it's sexier, and then they can always demur by, so, well, it's classified. I can't get
Right,
into,
right.
Yeah. And then I think it's like your ultimate man card to play and any sort of scrum with people about who's bigger and badder in some scene, in your life,
And there's also a whole chapter in your book about video games and movies and television shows and like how
Yeah.
that sort of informs like the popular zeitgeist of our culture.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, it's essentially because conventional wars can present very cinematically enticing set piece battles, and there's a conclusion usually. And in counterinsurgency, as you know well, there's no real victory parade. There are conclusive tactical engagements, but not strategic engagements that are conclusive. And so a lot of the movies that tend to be made because Americans they like shaping and clearing operations. They want something that's conclusive. So they go to SEAL movies or movies that are very, fine, fix, finish, and then we're home for, lobster and steak night on Thursday, So they like that kind of stuff. And then there's like movies about tragedy, the human cost and toil, like Taking Chance, about the Marine's body was returned to his family, and there's like movies on cultural aspects of it. But even, video games, as we all know, Call of Duty, Halo, these kind of games, all first person shooter. There's no game called tribal engagement. Who's going to get the highest number of confirmed key leader engagements? You're like, oh man, Green is crushing it. He spent so much money on drilling wells, and now the people have joined the Afghan local police program. There's no sexiness with that stuff. And the totality of all these things, though, shape the cultural context within which we grew up in, and then what we return to when we come back. And that's kind of shapes how we look at things. So masculinity has been kind of reimagined, since the 70s and 60s, and even more so today. It's an all volunteer military force. There's no obligation that people feel as much now to serve and to try to serve, and that's a self-selected group of people who serve. And then certain subcultures in our country self-select more than other subcultures, like the American South, the Hispanic community. There's all sorts of different groups that just join at higher rates than other communities, and that shapes things. All these like factors impact how we see our own service and how our service is seen.
With the video games, I think it's like kind of an interesting phenomenon because some of these games, of course, are games about special operations themselves. Yeah. And I mean, I remember guys, we would like go out, we would like be sitting around playing video games in our hooches, sitting around on time sensitive target, standby, get called and hit the pause button on the controller, go out and do the op, come back and then sit back down in their sweaty DCUs, hit the pause button again and go right back to playing.
Yeah.
And on one hand, like you can enjoy those games just as like the sort of visceral fun of running and gunning.
Right.
But if you actually play the Call of Duty games, they have like a contemporary but fictional special operations plot that is like super nihilistic.
Yes.
That you can't help but feel like it echoes something about the times we're living through, right?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, the direct action is essential to a successful counterinsurgency strategy, but it constantly mows the grass, but doesn't address the grassroots. Along those lines, like zombie movies, for example. I mean, there's like plenty of zombie video games. Those movies resonate with Iraq Afghan vets. We always talk about them because just the immediacy of sort of the tactical problem set. What weapons would you have? Who's in your group?
Yeah.
What's your bug out kit look like? Where would you hold up? What's your exit strategy? That's all very exciting. But like all those movies by and large take place in civilian settings that then become a zombie world, right? So the veteran who's come home and had to shelve all these mental sort of models of how to do war and behavior patterns and get used to now, driving a school bus every day, and, he's got these little behavior patterns. He likes to take the high ground. He parks his truck back in so he can drive out quick. He's got all these little things and then all of a sudden that civilian world becomes zombie world and he instinctively understands it, and in a way, there's also like perverse pleasure that some veterans take in the early stages of these zombie movies because they see the physical, mental softness of the civilian society to which they secretly sort of reject, all of a sudden destroyed by the hard logic of war, which is the zombies.
Right. And the zombie video games and movies are all fundamentally about the collapse of society, right?
Yes. Yeah. We have our own nihilism about, society and how soft it is. But I think the movies also resonate because none of us sort of joined the military because we saw a really compelling poster about sitting down and having tribal shuras, right? There's sort of this draw to combat, for our country. And I think zombie movies and zombie video games draw us in because I look at them as attrition escapism.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the war. This is the war we would kind of prefer, not the war we had. And also the zombie movies are like there's the non-strategy to it. There's no other than killing more zombies, attrition. And it's some determined end. It never ends, and there's no grand strategy. There are no generals. It's you and like 6 or 7 of your friends, or 12, however large you can get the group. And so it's like a critique of civilian society. It's escapism for us. And then on the civilian, when we get back, it's a way of maintaining that camaraderie with people. We have a socially sanctioned way of talking about killing things that no one will ask questions about.
Right. Yeah. A lot of them feature this like coming together of like communalism that's going to take place after the apocalypse. Like we're going to come together as a community and take care of each other.
Right. And that scratches the camaraderie itch that veterans have. Because I think through self-selection, training, and the experience of war, we become kind of reacquainted with our hunter-gatherer tribal natures in some ways. We have this camaraderie, and then we come home, and then our tribe is completely, destroyed, if you will. And so we're often looking for these camaraderie sort of institutions. It could be a political party, it could be a biker gang, it could be a knitting circle. You never know. It could be all these things. That instinct is there, and it's missing in the veteran sort of soul, and they gravitate towards things based on their backgrounds and their experiences.
Homes for Our Troops, HFOT, is a publicly funded nonprofit organization that builds and donates specially adapted custom homes nationwide for severely injured post 9/11 veterans to enable them to rebuild their lives. These homes restore some of the freedom and independence our veterans sacrificed while defending our country. Nearly 90 cents out of every dollar spent has gone directly to supporting our veterans and enabling them to rebuild their lives. Visit hfotusa.org. That's hfotusa.org to learn more.
When it comes to the films, how the GWOT has been portrayed in films, I think is also pretty interesting. You talk about that a lot in your book, and I mean, I was wondering about your thoughts on that. I mean, we've seen like Operation Red Wings turned into a film. Chris Kyle's life or his overseas life turned into a film.
Right.
But then at the same time, there are these sort of like big set piece moments. Operation Anaconda hasn't really gotten a film. Yeah. The Hunt for Zarqawi hasn't really gotten a film.
Right.
Even like the Vietnam era, like Mac v. Sog. I mean, it's surprising that hasn't been turned into a film. So it's very interesting what gets made into a movie and what doesn't. It's kind of maybe counterintuitive at times.
Yeah, I think you're right. Like Horse Soldiers was made into a movie. Mm-hmm. And again, these are all conclusive chapters of long war.
Yeah.
Right? Oh, Taliban, their fighting line was destroyed because we worked with local partners, and that's great. Now make a movie about village stability operations. It's just, I mean, you could, I guess, but I think you're right. And a lot of the movies that tend to be made tend to be anti-war movies. Like especially there's a large genre of anti-Iraq war movies. And I think they were often made not so much that people only oppose the war, but they oppose President Bush, perhaps, and there's like a political scores to settle. I think that's right. I mean, it'd be hard to make the proper movie. Like I was just thinking about the Green Beret movie with John Wayne. Mm-hmm. Depending on who you read, it's sort of pilloried. But as I look at it, I'm like, this is a really good take on the thing. Not having been in Vietnam, but having read deeply about the kind of village stability stuff that they tried to do. I kind of like it. There's enough of the elements there to kind of make it right. It's very patriotic, which resonates with me. Maybe it's too much for some, but I thought that was pretty good. Yeah, I don't think we've seen the proper GWOT movie yet. And a lot of those missions, like Zarqawi, they're so classified still, or the people who did it, and it was never talked about. So that moment may have been lost, at least for now.
Have you seen Scott Mann's play Last Out?
I know Scott Mann. I've not seen it. I'm aware of. I know we know each other, and he's kind of endorsed one of my books in the past, but I haven't seen it yet.
I hope you go check it out, because that's actually, now that we're on this topic, that's the first. Yeah. That's the only thing, the only media of any format I've ever seen that I felt like adequately tells that sort of like a soldier's journey through the global war on terror from a new guy to, in that case, a team sergeant in special forces. And Scott did a terrific job with that play.
I hope he writes a novel or someone writes a novel like that. I think the novels for this generation are ripe for being written. I mean, we've got several have won literary awards. I actually talk about how I think the Marine Corps is the most literary of the force services, just to look at the awards their authors have received for their books, like Redeployment, Phil Clay National Book Award. Elliot Ackerman's book was a runner-up for National Book Award. But also the diversity of it too. You've got what's his name? Fick wrote his memoir, which is really well received, got a lot of awards. You've got like Marcus Luttrell got a literary award for Lone Survivor. And there's like the Little Birds, I think, that was a runner-up for the National Book Award. But I think the Marine Corps, like with J.D. Vance's memoir, Hillbilly Elegy, talks about his time in the Marine Corps, I think in Iraq. So I think the Marine Corps seems to have a broad swath of people that it's certainly difficult to become a Marine, but it's more attainable, I think, to a broader swath of Americans, and there are more of them than Green Berets and SEALs, and I think you get people who are like Princeton grads, like Congressman Mike Gallagher is a SEAL, a Marine officer, who's a PhD, all the way to J.D. Vance, who kind of came from more difficult circumstances. It's sort of a broader swath, and a lot of them go into the agency, and a lot of them, I think they have a little culture of being an insurgency as well within the military, and I think they also have a great tradition of literary contributions like Mattis and talking about libraries and books and reading. They have a different culture, I feel, and it seems to lend itself.
And they're very proud of their history too, which I think feeds into it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they have an elan to them that's achievable, but elite, but broad enough that it can be sort of vacuum up a broader swath of Americans to write books on, I think. Yeah.
So the larger topic, addressed in your book is sort of like the returning war veteran and coming home and what they experience. And so I was wondering if we want to talk about that aspect of it a little bit.
Yeah, I think about what does this generation experience? They've largely had multiple tours, or war. We were attacked. War of sort of a choice that was made. Predominantly wars in Muslim countries, doing counterinsurgency and all the tasks that come from that. And there are all these adaptations to these experiences that you go through. One very minimally, we all know essentially when you go to war, you adapt to it physically, emotionally, mentally, psychologically, morally. And these adaptations are there to help you survive and to thrive, hopefully, at minimum to survive. And then you bring all these adaptations home. And depending on where you end up in life, if you come home, you're still in the military, you're still in a combat unit, you may not experience that transition so profoundly. I mean, you still are, but it's not as. But if you completely get out, and you're no longer going to go back in, that quickness to aggression isn't as helpful at a traffic stop. The moral grayness that you need in counterinsurgency at times to work with locals, for example, is not as good when you start doing small little things. You're cutting corners morally, start pinching things or not treating people correctly. Like the emotional deadening that you have to create to deal with death and destruction. But on the other flip side, camaraderie. I mean, most people, when you live with someone who's not related to you in your life, is usually your spouse. It's the first time in your life that happens. But now you've had this other contrary experience. You have 12 other people in your group, whatever, who aren't related to you. But my God, you feel that camaraderie. The word brotherhood is used all the time. And you miss that camaraderie. So that's another element of coming home. But also, I think counterinsurgency, yes, if you're in combat with the insurgents, you likely will see them, but you more often than not in counterinsurgency, you see the effects of their acts. You don't see them committing the act. You see the IED, you don't know how it got there. You see the Taliban night letter, you don't know how it got there, and I find for a lot of vets, you become very good at indirect sort of inferring things and sort of reading between the lines of things and trying to recreate things in your mind. And you become, your sense of empathy increases a lot too by working with locals. And that all these little mental habits are really hardwired because they're connected to sort of surviving and thriving. They're not just, once in a while, and they're like your whole tour. And so when you come home, you start to see the way you can operate indirectly to achieve your goals, not direct. You start to mentally become an insurgent at home at times. You see, when you think of tribes, you see them as these interconnected sort of networks in your mind, this lattice work of connections that you can pluck and play and move, hopefully. And then you come home, and most Americans, because they've only known stability and they only known institutionalism, they sort of accept things at face value and like, well, I didn't get that scholarship. I won't get it this time. I'll have to reapply. It's like, well, where does this guy park his car? Maybe I can park my car next to him and bump into each other and have an impromptu. You start to have these little indirect ways so you see institutions as sort of the opening shot, but you sort of see them as people with folks who can be influenced. You start to indirectly operate, I find, and you have a deep sympathy and empathetic understanding of other people, and then you're trying to use that knowledge to change their behavior, to manipulate them to some degree, or sort of move them along the path to some decision you want them to take. So there's always like weird behaviors, and then you come home and you sort of go through this process of sort of unlearning them. Some of them will be with you that are really positive, and some are not so positive. It depends. Like sometimes you hit a wall, like maybe moral grayness hits a wall, and you've got that clarity moment, like, yeah, you can't operate that way anymore. Or you're yelling at the guy at the bagel counter because you got your bagel wrong somehow. Like, what am I doing? Like, that's not out of proportion to what's required.
I think there's a lot of veterans out there who have this this quest for validity. Not that they want to be like individually valorized or like they need to be recognized as some sort of war hero, but I think that when we come back home, the entire war can feel like it was just some weird fever dream. Yeah. And maybe when you reach back to like one of your old army buddies and you start to have these memories and share these past experiences, it's like, oh yeah, that really did happen. Yeah, it's not just like some weird bizarre nightmare we all had together. Yeah. But I think that, by the nature of having an all volunteer force, and then these guys coming back into normal society, they're sort of walking around with this thing like that. Again, I don't think they need to be, individually recognized as war heroes, but I think they want the war itself to be recognized and acknowledged that it actually happened.
Yeah. I mean, we're this weird spot because, a lot of people have served in these conflicts. Many got out years ago, they've all started new lives, but the way Afghanistan ended and Iraq is sort of where it's at. It was a different kind of victory parade. It was a Taliban victory parade.
Right.
Not one for us. So I think people are almost at a moment, like I know for me, it's like, I don't really want to think about it right now. I want to do other things in life, give me a few more years and maybe I'll reflect on it more. I like how you put a fever dream. Yeah, it feels like that at times. Most of my friends are Iraq Afghan vets now. It's kind of over time that's kind of happened slowly but surely. And we talk amongst ourselves about aspect of it, but there's also a feeling of like, you can't do anything about it now, right. And I can't write that once again, learned op-ed in the 20th paper I've written this op-ed about what needs to change and will never change. So you just kind of make peace with it. And, I think you take that energy you've expended on the war and you throw it into something new, whether it's politics or family or business or whatever. I mean, China's absorbing a lot of people's energies and time now, sort of like, I feel like as a naval officer, all my time was Iraq, Afghanistan, not the actual Navy. And now that I'm still in the Navy Reserves, like we're going to China, and of course the Navy is huge in that. I feel like I'm starting a whole new career. Mm-hmm. I feel like I'm just starting. I don't know a lot about big Navy. I know a lot about Special Operations Navy, but not big Navy.
Do you think that as GWOT veterans, do you think it's important for us to kind of like just take the L on this one and just like accept the loss, as Jim Gant wrote to me once, and he said, there's a lot of coulda, woulda, shouldas right now, but the reality is that the Taliban soundly defeated us at a strategic level. I mean, do you think it's important for us to just accept that, if for nothing else, so that like we can move on to the next stage in our lives?
No, I think you got to understand, like, why was their strategic loss? The decisions that were made early in the war in Afghanistan in particular put us in strategic ditches that we didn't know yet were sort of bad for us. Usually when you invade, you're the most confident in your ability, but the least wise about the situation. And then as the war progresses and you sort of double down, become more, well, we need to become more lethal. Okay, and you start going through that and you find that is insufficient. Then you think, well, we need to we need to be more, take more risks and all these. So you go through this process, but because the terms of the conflict were fundamentally misunderstood at the outset, and because declarations of victory were initially done along conventional warfare terms, not irregular warfare terms, there's like this political trap. So you have to let the first leaders that designed the war essentially have to leave. And then those who learned about the war at the lower levels but weren't implicated in the initial strategic planning, they get to move up. But by that point, that we've now crossed over, we're now less confident but more wise. But now the American people were told, well, maybe we won, I thought, or we were close to winning, but we're not winning. That creates some political conundrums. And then we kind of have to rush and hurry up and implement these decisions to apply lessons learned now by the people who kind of learned at a lower level, but because the war has gone on so long, they were to move up. Like Petraeus wasn't involved in the Iraq planning, but he was a 2-star in Mosul who learned a lot from that experience. And he was able to move up eventually and apply some of these lessons learned. McChrystal with JSOC, they learned a lot of lessons. They learned them in the dark. There wasn't that public glare of criticism. There was on occasion, but like generally they weren't wire brushed with that. So they were able to learn, and every day they had feedback loops. Every night, feedback loops. So as an institution, they were able to kind of innovate in the shadows to their great credit, and the kinds of people who were there made it easier. But even they took a long time. And then by the time you actually figure it out, I usually say we usually have it right just before we leave. But then you add to that constant rotations of personnel. We never get to wisdom. It's always situational awareness. And then like the Green Berets didn't really come up with village stability operations until 2010. When they were like, why am I here my 4th, 5th tour clearing the same village?
Right.
You got to be, I know more about Afghanistan now. It's been 5-10 years, they're at a different point, but why does it need to take that long? That's the thing I'm interested in. So long story short, I think we absolutely need to study why this is our 3rd conflict, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, that didn't end the way we had wanted to end before at the beginning. Why is that? And we need to think about that as we think about China.
The other thing that I wanted to ask you about, and sort of like what your experiences or your observations are, I think that, when I got out, I definitely went through this like difficult phase of transitioning into civilian life, like without a doubt. And what's kind of interesting, but also kind of sad is today with social media, you can see it really quickly. There's always this new age group of guys who are getting out of the military.
Yeah.
And because of social media, you can actually see them going through that process. Yeah. Like I did, like so many other guys did. Yeah. And it's actually, it is a little sad to see them go through that same painful process, like over and over again, a new younger generation going through it over and over again.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you've seen any of that, and if you think it's possible to, like, I don't know, is there some sort of like societal growth or cultural learning that we can do that, like, maybe this process doesn't have to be quite as painful?
Yeah, the nice thing about the reserves is like at least once every month I have an opportunity to have group therapy with my fellow reservists,
Right.
And I think if you're active duty, you're out, unless you go reserves, right? And then unless you stay in touch with a small group of friends from your prior service, I can imagine it feels very isolating. I don't know what the process would be. I mean, I have to think about it a lot because I'm kind of still in that world, the military world. Mm-hmm. And I dread the day I'll be out, even as a reservist. It's such a part of my identity. I can't imagine not having it anymore. But I think I'll turn within like a day or two. I'll become that grizzled vet. I'll have my little hat with the Iraq Afghan thing vet on the top. I'll grow out a beard and talk about how it was harder when I was in and sort of shake my fist. I don't know. I think I think you can process your war better when there's actually a victory parade of some sort, mm-hmm. Or some conclusion. I mean, as much as no one wanted the Taliban to win, it's over. Like there's a concluding element to it now. It's not going to be a coulda, woulda, shoulda. Now it's over. I don't know. I think because so few people served in the military, let alone served in Iraq and Afghanistan, it's like. But I'm grateful for social media and Twitter. It's let me stay in touch with a lot more people. Mm-hmm. And if I didn't have it, it would be really hard. Like really, Twitter's been great to stay in touch with other vets and the stuff you do, and like all these other vets who've gone into journalism and writing and movies. That's been really. I feel like there's a community there that people I've not met, but I know them.
Right. Right.
Yeah. And that's kind of
It,
a cool thing.
and it's, I mean, this maybe sounds a little outrageous considering what I do, and maybe you have the same sort of experience, but it's like I live in Brooklyn. There's
Yeah.
nobody really around here that's
Yeah.
like me in that sense, and that's fine. You know,
Yeah.
I like being here,
Yeah.
but through like the work that I do and sort of those interconnections, I mean, it
Yeah.
becomes this like this one place where like you can kind of have those shared experiences and reflect back on that time, that those commonalities that we have through the military that
Yeah.
otherwise wouldn't really exist here.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I'm excited. There's probably now well over 200 Iraq Afghan war memoirs now, for sure. I need to update my database, but like, I'm excited about the movies, the plays, because there was a book I read that really informed my approach to this book. Is by a guy named Willard Waller, and he was a PhD sociologist who served in World War One, and they wrote a book called The Veteran Comes Back, which was
Mhm.
published in 1944.
Wow.
He actually had a heart attack the next year and died, but the book was fascinating because it went beyond the psychological explanations for everything. And then it also delved into how veterans come home and how they change society when they come home. And how do they change society? And that's the stuff that's really exciting to me. I mean, we have so many Iraq Afghan vets now that are elected to Congress, and state legislators seats and city councils. And there's instantly, you can see a camaraderie amongst many of them because they're sort of at odds with the typical politician mentality already. They have a very different worldview as it is, but then they have these other Iraq Afghan vets, and they do the talking amongst themselves just like any other military bunch of guys do. They razz on Crenshaw, they tease Mike Waltz. It's all this commonality, but then I think they have a very different perspective because these abstract terms of duty, honor, country, courage, commitment, patriotism that are real. They're real, but now they're kind of imbued with a deeper, special, visceral meaning for these people. And now they're in a position to make them real for folks. And veterans who run for office, they have their language naturally is one of leadership and accomplishing objectives. They're expected to be leaders. They're trained to do so. They're used to be being part of a team. So camaraderie and fellowship and being a team is kind of a unique characteristic among politicians. They tend to speak about accomplishing things, not just it's not just talking points, getting things accomplished. And they're also very good at implementing campaign plans, whether for running for office or for an isolated valley somewhere. So there's a lot of I think there's a lot of interesting ways that we're starting to see the impact of this culture. I mean, for example, with Governor Ron DeSantis, he's an Iraq vet, served in Fallujah as a JAG to a SEAL team. Maybe he might get elected president, be the first Iraq Afghan vet elected president. There are other, all these things are starting to come out now in our culture. It's very, very interesting to see, especially for a lot of the vets who've done multiple tours. General Mattis talked about kind of post-deployment growth. Because a lot of the narrative is you do so many tours, you must be really in a difficult spot. It's like, no, actually, I'm at the top of my game. I've done so many. I'm like, I'm so resilient now. I can overcome so many things that would cause someone else. I talk about that in a book a little bit. Like there's this genre, this type of veteran who's like really these years were excellent for them. they grew from this stuff. They can multitask like nobody. So it's so like that whole hero victim psychopath thing I think is true to some degree, but it has to be revisited. And I'm excited to see how we shape culture. I'm looking forward to the future novels and movies and getting elected to office, and I'm excited about all that stuff for the future.
Yeah, absolutely. It will be interesting to see. I think, I think the story hasn't really quite been told yet. But I mean, Scott Mann shows that it can be done. So
yeah. I mean, the way he's been treated, he used to train police departments in counterinsurgency strategies and tactics.
Oh, cool.
There's all sorts of ways of ideas, and I think I really encourage vets to run for office and get involved because we're often used as patriotic bunting to normal politicians. And hey, you're not a victim. You're a leader. You're a velociraptor. You're not a brontosaurus. Get out there and like you. I mean, how is it you go from being in charge of a valley, a village, a part of a mountain where you can call in strikes from above, you can direct men and women in combat, to all of a sudden like, well, I hope they invite me to the event. Come on, get out there. Like, try it out. Get out there. Do it.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. I also try to encourage guys not to sell themselves short. There are guys who get out and they think, well, I'm just a dumb ranger. I can't do this. Or it's like, no, you can go and get an MBA. You can go get a PhD in astrophysics if that's what you want to do. There are all these possibilities that are open to these guys.
Yeah, and look, you have fought to defend and preserve this republic overseas. Come home and fight and protect it here at home now. Run for office. Get involved, restore the republic. If you don't like extremism, you fought it overseas, fight it here at home. It's not bullets, it's talking points. It's persuasion, not power projection. It's you get involved in that way. I mean, our republic needs it desperately, I think. Both parties, but just get in there some way.
So again, the book is Front Toward Enemy by Dan Green. Any final points you want to make about the book or anything else before we get going?
Yeah, I just would be grateful for anyone to give it a read if you're kind of still figuring out your own experiences and trying to understand your path in America. Books written by psychologists are absolutely helpful in many ways, but I hope this book introduces you a kind of more holistic way of looking at your experience and the context of this generation and how this generation's served from a philosophical, sociological, historical, political, and cultural perspective. And I hope, I've touched on some things that we've all experienced in isolation, and then maybe you see it a little bit more like, okay, others have gone through it. Hopefully that's helpful to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And your other book is In the Warlord's Shadow. About village stability operations in Afghanistan. Yeah,
I've written 3 other books, actually. I co-wrote one on Fallujah Redux, the Anbar Awakening and the struggle with Al-Qaeda with a colleague of mine, and The Valley's Edge, a year with the Pashtuns in the heartland of the Taliban, is when I was there with the State Department in Afghanistan. So, and The Warlord's Shadow. So a few books. They've all sold in the dozens, so I'm very proud, of that. But yeah, it's not so much the sales is important, it's just getting the message out in my mind. But yeah.
Well, that's okay. I'm proud to have tens of readers.
Yeah, exactly. My father always asks how many he has to buy this time. That's my so double the amount last time, Dad. Double the amount.
All right, Dan. Well, thank you so much. And please stay in touch, and we'll talk again about whatever the next project is, wherever it takes you.
Great. Thanks so much. And check me out on Twitter at DanGreenFL and give me a follow. Love to hear what you have to say.
That's our show for today. I hope you enjoyed this wide-ranging conversation about modern-day military veterans. This was a little different than some of our other shows, but I'm glad we could get Dan on here to talk about his book. As far as the war on terror veterans and their role in society, we're just sort of at the very beginning of tackling with and grappling that issue and what it means for America. Yes, there is still a war on in many ways, one that some people would probably rather not acknowledge, but combat has really wound down or ended by comparison to the bad old days in Iraq or Afghanistan. This is a conversation that we're all going to have a few more times, I think, whether it's over beers with your military buddy during a backyard barbecue or on a podcast like this. I hope all of you out there will keep talking about your military service, thinking about it, and even laughing about it at times in a healthy, positive way. So thank you all of you for joining us. I'm Jack Murphy, and this is Military Matters.
Go to stripes.com, use promo code podcast, and save 50% on your digital subscription. Go to stripes.com today. This episode was brought to you by Homes for Our Troops, a nonprofit helping build and donate homes to injured post-9/11 veterans. Visit hfotusa.org for more information.